A black single dad walked into a restaurant with only $50 and fragile hope, but what happened at that window table changed his life forever. The apartment had never felt smaller than it did that evening, walls pressing in with the weight of winter air seeping through thin panes of glass. Malik Johnson stood in front of a cracked mirror propped against the dresser, tugging at the sleeves of a shirt he had ironed twice just to make it look presentable. The fabric had softened over the years, threads thinning at the cuffs, but tonight he treated it like it was something new. On the corner of the dresser sat a plain white envelope. He opened it slowly, fingers brushing across the folded bills inside. This envelope was his lifeline, tucked away in a drawer for true emergencies, rent that fell short, medicine when Ava caught a fever, a utility bill that couldn't wait. Tonight, for the first time in years, he had dared to reach for it, slipping out $50 and pressing the flap shut again as though sealing away both guilt and hope. In the doorway, small footsteps padded across worn floorboards. Ava appeared, her braids tied with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved. She held on to the end of her father's tie, her face glowing with the kind of innocence that didn't yet know what disappointment felt like. She stood on tiptoe, fumbling with the knot. "Daddy, will she like you?" The question came out so simple, so certain, that Malik's heart clenched. He forced a smile, smoothing her hand over the tie. "I don't know, sweetheart," he whispered. "I just hope I can like myself a little tonight." Ava tilted her head, studying him with all the seriousness a little girl could carry, then nodded as if she had already decided he would be perfect. She ran off to fetch her coloring book, humming a tune her late mother used to sing, leaving Malik staring at the mirror again, his throat tight. Outside, the Boston air was sharp and unforgiving. Snow crunched under his shoes as he walked toward the restaurant, $50 tucked in his wallet like both a promise and a risk. He rehearsed numbers in his head, how far the money might stretch, how many dishes he could scan before pretending he wasn't hungry. The glow of the restaurant lights spilled onto the icy sidewalk, warmer than anything he'd felt in weeks. For a moment he hesitated at the door, his breath clouding in the air, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wasn't used to thinking of himself as a man with the right to sit in places like this. He was a father, a worker, a man who scraped by day after day. But tonight he was trying to remember what it meant to simply be Malik. He stepped inside, greeted by polished wood and low candlelight. Conversations hummed around him, the sound of couples laughing, hands brushing across white tablecloths. The hostess smiled politely, leading him to a small table by the window. Malik sat down carefully, as if he might break something fragile just by taking a seat. He placed his wallet in his pocket, feeling the thinness of it like a secret pressed against his side. His hands rested on the linen napkin, fingers trembling faintly before he drew them back, folding them together as though prayer might carry him through the night. He told himself he wasn't here for miracles. He was here for a chance, even if it was a fragile one. He thought of Ava adjusting his tie, of her voice so certain that someone out there might like him. And as he lifted his gaze toward the door, his chest filled with the kind of nervous hope that hadn't touched him in years. For Malik Johnson, this was more than a blind date. It was a test of whether a man with nothing left but $50 and a father's heart could still dare to believe he deserved to be chosen. The restaurant glowed with a kind of warmth Malik hadn't felt in years. Candles flickered on every table, soft shadows stretching across polished wood. Outside, the night pressed cold against the windows, snow drifting down in slow, deliberate flakes. But here, inside, the world hummed with laughter, forks tapping plates, the muted clink of glasses raised in quiet toasts. Malik sat by the window, his back straight, his palms resting carefully against the folded napkin on his lap. The table looked too elegant for him, too carefully arranged, as if one wrong move might shatter the illusion that he belonged here. He checked his watch once, then again. 6:45 had slipped into 7 o'clock. He told himself traffic could be heavy. Maybe she had to fix her hair, maybe she was running late. Hope clung to him like a stubborn flame, refusing to die. At 7:15, the hostess guided another couple past his table, their laughter spilling into the room like a melody he couldn't follow. He lifted his head each time the door opened, a rush of anticipation tightening in his chest, only for it to collapse again when strangers brushed snow from their coats and claimed seats across the room. By 7:30, his smile had grown thin, his excuses thinner. The water glass before him was nearly empty, condensation dripping onto the tablecloth. He reached for his phone, scrolling back to the last message she had sent that afternoon. "Can't wait to see you tonight." The words burned on the screen, promises wrapped in pixels that now mocked him. His thumb hovered, then typed a quick line, "I'm here, just checking in." He waited, staring at the glow of his screen, willing those 3 small dots to appear. For a long moment nothing came. Then his phone buzzed in his hand, sharp and sudden, pulling him toward hope. He opened the message, breath caught in his throat. "Wow, you actually went. I was just messing with you. Sorry, but you're not really my type. Not worth the Uber." A second notification blinked almost immediately. "You seem nice, but seriously, you thought I was actually coming?" Malik froze, the words drilling into him until the letters blurred. Around him, the room carried on. A fork scraped a plate, a couple laughed softly at a private joke, music spilled from hidden speakers. The world did not pause for his humiliation. Heat surged up his neck, not the heat of anger but the raw burn of shame. He pressed his lips together, holding back the sting in his eyes. His fingers clenched around the phone, knuckles pale. He slid it face down onto the table, as if turning it over could erase what had been said. The server passed by, pausing just long enough to offer a polite smile. "Would you like to order something, sir?" Malik's throat tightened. "No, thank you," he managed, voice almost breaking. "I'm still waiting." But he wasn't. And deep down he knew it. He shifted in his seat, sliding his worn wallet open under the table. Inside lay a single folded bill, a $5 note he had promised himself he wouldn't touch. 50 had already been too much, a risk he couldn't afford. Now even that had bought him nothing but emptiness. He tucked the wallet back into his pocket, fingers trembling, pulling the napkin tighter across his lap as though it could shield him from the hollow ache clawing in his chest. Couples leaned toward each other across candlelight, hands brushing, voices hushed with tenderness. Malik sat alone, his glass nearly drained, his hunger masked by the weight pressing against his ribs. He drew a long breath, his gaze fixed once more on the door, as if sheer will might conjure the figure who would never come. His lips parted, a whisper barely audible beneath the music and clatter. "I showed up, and that wasn't enough." The words hung in the air like a confession, not meant for anyone else, just for the silence that had already judged him. Naomi Caldwell had not come to the restaurant for company that night. She had come because after a long day of boardrooms and presentations, she needed a corner of the city where she could exhale without anyone asking her for answers. She had taken her usual seat near the back, a glass of wine resting untouched at her elbow, her phone face down beside it with unread emails stacking silently in the background. The candlelight flickered across her blazer, sleeves rolled just enough to loosen the stiffness of her day. For once, she had wanted to be invisible. But across the room, by the window, a man caught her attention. At first it was nothing more than a glimpse, the way he straightened his posture too carefully, as though holding himself together required every muscle he had. The way his eyes flicked to the door with a hope so raw it almost embarrassed her to witness it. People came and went in silence all the time, strangers brushing past each other without leaving a trace. Yet something about this man resisted the anonymity of the room. She told herself not to stare. She had seen ambition in men who shook her hand after deals, arrogance in men who tried to cut her off in negotiations, charm in men who thought they could win her over with half a smile. But what she saw now was none of those things. It was hope. Hope so fragile it trembled in his hands as he clutched the phone on the table. She watched the brief flicker of relief that crossed his face when the screen lit up. And she saw it vanish a heartbeat later, replaced by the slump of his shoulders, the rigid line of his jaw, the look of someone who had just been cut open by words no one else could hear. Naomi felt the recognition like a bruise pressed too suddenly. She knew what rejection looked like. Hers had not been on a date or over a glowing phone screen, but in the boardroom, years ago, when she had stood to present her first proposal. She could still hear the clipped voice of the chairman dismissing her before she had finished a sentence. Too young. Too inexperienced. And though he had not said it out loud, she had seen the truth in his eyes. Too black. Too female. That moment had burned itself into her, a scar disguised beneath success. She had learned to straighten her spine, to smooth her expression, to keep her voice steady even when her heart thundered with humiliation. Watching the man at the window, she saw that same effort carved into his posture. The desperate attempt to appear unaffected while something inside him cracked quietly apart. Naomi leaned back, her glass untouched. The restaurant around them buzzed on, unaware that at one table a man was unraveling while at another a woman was remembering what it felt like to be unseen. She studied him longer than she meant to. The way he tapped his finger lightly against the rim of the water glass, not impatiently but nervously. The way he kept glancing at the door, still trying to believe someone might appear. He wasn't just waiting for dinner. He was waiting for proof that he mattered, waiting for someone to choose him. Naomi's chest tightened, an ache she hadn't expected. She had built her life on control, on deciding outcomes. Yet here she was, watching a stranger lose a battle she knew too well, and she could not shake the thought that one act of kindness, uncalculated and simple, might mean more than any victory she had ever claimed at the head of a boardroom table. She raised her hand slightly, catching the eye of a passing server, then hesitated. Not yet. Something told her the moment had to come carefully, quietly, without spectacle. So she waited, watching him still, her decision forming in the silence between them like a seed pressed deep into the soil, waiting to break through. The server approached quietly, balancing a tray with practiced ease, and set down a steaming plate of pasta and a tall glass of sparkling lemonade in front of Malik. He blinked at it, startled, his hands frozen above the napkin in his lap. His first thought was that it had to be a mistake. He shook his head quickly, voice low, almost apologetic. I didn't order this. The server only smiled kindly, repeating a line that carried more weight than Malik could understand in that moment. It's been taken care of, sir. Someone requested it for you. The bill is already settled. Malik stared at the food, steam rising in soft curls, the scent warm and real. His chest tightened, suspicion pricking at the edges of his thoughts. Was this another cruel joke, another reminder that the world knew how to laugh at men like him? His eyes darted around the room, scanning faces for smirks, waiting for the burst of laughter that would tell him he had fallen into another trap. His fingers clenched against the tablecloth, knuckles straining as his pride battled his hunger. That was when a voice reached him, steady and calm, threading through the low hum of the restaurant. It's not charity. Malik turned sharply, startled. Standing just behind him was a woman whose presence seemed to command the candlelight itself. Naomi's posture was poised, her blazer framing her with quiet authority, but her eyes held something softer, something unguarded. She stepped closer, her words deliberate. It's dignity. And you deserve it. For a moment Malik could only stare. The air around him felt heavier, charged with the weight of something he had not heard in years. Deserve. He had been told to endure, to toughen up, to make do with less. But no one had ever told him he deserved anything, least of all kindness served on a plate. His throat worked as if trying to form words that would not come. He managed only a whisper. I don't understand. Naomi moved to the chair across from his, resting her hand lightly on its back. May I? She asked, though the certainty in her tone suggested she would sit whether he said yes or no. Malik nodded faintly, his mind still reeling. She lowered herself into the seat, not with pity, not with arrogance, but with the calm presence of someone who simply intended to stay. The restaurant's noise seemed to fade around them, as though the entire room had shifted focus. Malik's hand hovered uncertainly above the fork. To accept this meal felt dangerous, like stepping into a space where gratitude might tear down the walls he had spent years building. "You didn't have to do this," he said finally, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. Naomi met his gaze without flinching. "I know. That's why it matters." The words landed between them like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward, unsettling the silence he had grown used to. Malik looked down at the pasta again, the steam rising into his face. Hunger twisted in his stomach, but it was his chest that ached more. Slowly, almost cautiously, he lifted the fork and tested the first bite. The taste broke something open inside him. It wasn't just food. It was a reminder that he hadn't been invisible after all, that someone had noticed, someone had chosen to acknowledge his worth without demanding anything in return. He set the fork down, his voice unsteady, barely above the hum of the restaurant. "No one's ever said that to me before." Naomi leaned back slightly, her glass of wine still untouched, her lips curving in the faintest trace of a smile. "Then it was long overdue." Malik drew a slow breath, his shoulders sagging as though for the first time in years he had been allowed to set down a burden. The humiliation of minutes ago still clung to him, but it was tempered now, softened by a kindness he did not know how to hold. He was not ready to trust it fully, not yet, but the seed had been planted. And in the quiet glow of candlelight, with dignity served across the table, Malik Johnson began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was worth more than the world had told him. The first time Naomi reached out after that night, it was with something as simple as a cup of coffee. Malik had stopped by a small cafe tucked between the library and a row of brick buildings, a place he visited only when his budget allowed. He was standing in line, eyes on the chalkboard menu, calculating silently which option wouldn't stretch his wallet too thin, when he heard a voice behind him. "Make it 2, she told the barista, "and add oat milk to his." Malik turned, startled, to see Naomi standing there, her blazer sleeves rolled back, a faint smile softening her otherwise commanding presence. He shook his head quickly, embarrassed. "You don't have to do that." She shrugged lightly. "Maybe I don't. But I want to." Malik hesitated, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "People like me don't sit at tables with people like you." For a moment, Naomi studied him, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Then maybe it's time someone pulled up a chair." The words landed heavier than he expected, stirring something he had buried under years of self-doubt. He didn't answer right away, but when she chose a corner table near the window, Malik found himself walking over, his coffee in hand, as though gravity itself had pulled him into that seat. They talked quietly that morning, not about the past or pain, but about small things, the Boston weather, the hum of the cafe, the latest mishap with Ava's school project that left glitter stuck to the apartment carpet for days. Naomi listened without rushing him, and Malik found himself laughing once, unguarded, before quickly covering it with a sip of coffee. He wasn't used to being this open. Days later, an email arrived. Naomi had sent him a digital pass to a workshop on early childhood nutrition hosted by Caldwell Organics. "Thought this might align with your world," she had written. No pressure. Malik almost deleted it. He wasn't a doctor, not a researcher, not anyone who belonged in a room full of experts. He was just a father who had learned how to stretch $1 into meals that kept his daughter full. But something about her words, "no pressure," made him stop. The day of the workshop, he slipped into the back row of the conference room, feeling out of place among the neat rows of students, mothers with notepads, professionals scribbling ideas. Naomi was at the front, introducing the keynote speaker, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had built empires but still found time to notice a single father in the shadows. Malik kept his head down, but when the speaker asked if there were questions, his hand lifted before he could stop it. The room stilled. His voice came low but steady. "What about single parents who don't have time to cook everything fresh? Sometimes it's frozen dinners or nothing. What should we be looking for on the labels when both time and money are against us?" A hush spread across the room. The question cut through the polished conversation with the weight of lived experience. Eyes turned toward him, some surprised, some softened. The speaker paused, then nodded slowly. That is a very good question. He went on to answer, but Naomi's gaze lingered at the back of the room. She had seen ambitious interns ask clever questions to impress. This was different. Malik wasn't trying to prove anything. He was speaking because it mattered, because he carried the truth of fathers and mothers who fought every day to give their children more than the world thought they deserved. And in that moment, his voice held more authority than any expert at the front of the room. Malik shifted uncomfortably under the attention, but when the session ended he slipped out quickly, his steps pulling him toward the library where Ava waited. Yet behind him, the silence he left in that room told its own story. For the first time, Malik Johnson had not been invisible. He had been heard. The children's corner of the library was warm with afternoon light, rows of picture books spilling color across the carpet. Malik had just arrived to pick up Ava when he noticed her standing still, her braids clicking softly as she tilted her head toward the woman who had come with him. Naomi had walked in quietly, sleeves rolled up from her morning at work, laptop tucked under one arm. Ava stepped closer, small fingers brushing against the hem of Naomi's coat, her voice a whisper that carried louder than anything else in the room. She smells like mommy's perfume. Malik froze, the words hitting him like a stone dropped into deep water. His chest seized, breath caught sharp. He hadn't prepared for this, hadn't imagined his daughter would summon the ghost of her mother in the middle of a library. His eyes darted to Naomi, half apologetic, half pleading, as if he could shield them both from the weight of that truth. Naomi's composure faltered for the briefest second. She crouched slowly to meet Ava's gaze, her face softening in a way Malik hadn't seen before. That's a big compliment, she said gently, her tone tender, almost reverent. Your mommy must have had excellent taste. Ava nodded with the certainty only a child could hold, then skipped back toward the books, satisfied. Malik stood rooted in place, his throat tight, glassy eyes refusing to spill tears. She doesn't usually say things like that, he murmured, almost to himself. Naomi looked at him then, really looked, and in her eyes he saw not pity but recognition, a quiet respect for the love and loss he carried every day. That night the weight of Ava's words returned with force. She had caught a fever, her small body curled beneath a blanket on the couch. Malik hovered, torn between the soup simmering on the stove and the worry twisting in his chest. He paced, helpless, until a soft knock sounded at the door. Naomi stepped inside, carrying a small bag. She didn't ask permission. She simply knelt beside Ava, pressing a cool hand to the girl's forehead. From her bag she pulled a folded cloth, soaked in a lavender compress, and laid it gently across Ava's brow. Malik's shoulders sagged in relief, but the tension in him didn't leave. He stood nearby, hands gripping the back of a chair, watching. Then Naomi began to hum. At first it was no more than a whisper of melody, fragile against the quiet of the room. But the tune grew clearer, wrapping around the child like a lullaby carried from another lifetime. Malik's breath caught. His late wife had sung that song countless nights, a gospel hymn her mother had taught her, altered with silly rhymes to make Ava laugh through tears. It was a sound Malik had locked away, too painful to remember. Now, hearing it again, was like a door opening to a room he thought had been sealed forever. The ladle slipped from his hand and clattered against the stove. He sank into the armchair, head in his palms, his body trembling as grief surged through cracks he had tried to plaster over. The tears came before he could stop them, hot and unrelenting. Naomi's voice wavered for half a moment when she noticed, but she did not stop. She kept singing until Ava's breathing evened, until the fevered restlessness softened into sleep. Only then did she look toward Malik, her eyes shining with her own unspoken ache. You couldn't have known, he whispered, his voice raw, barely audible. Naomi shook her head gently. I didn't have to know, she said softly. Some things just find their way back. In the stillness that followed, Malik felt something shift inside him. The humiliation, the self-doubt, the years of telling himself he had to endure alone, all of it cracked under the weight of that melody, under the kindness of a woman who had walked into his brokenness and stayed. It was more than comfort. It was recognition, healing wrapped in song. And as Ava slept, her small hand curled around Naomi's wrist, Malik understood that for the first time since losing his wife, he wasn't carrying it all by himself. The letter had arrived in a plain white envelope, its edges worn from where Malik's fingers had folded and unfolded it for days before he found the courage to share it. A full scholarship, a year of training in Oregon, a chance to step into a career that could change everything for him and Ava. Pride had surged in his chest when he first read the words, but it was quickly followed by fear, because opportunity often meant distance, and distance was a price he wasn't sure he could pay. On the evening he finally told Naomi, they were sitting on a park bench while Ava chased bubbles across the grass, her laughter carrying on the wind. Malik's voice was tight as he said it. I got the scholarship. It's in Oregon. A year away. I don't want you to think I'm walking away now that things feel steady. He braced himself for disappointment, for anger, for the quiet closing of a door. But Naomi only leaned back, studying him with a gaze that was steady and unshaken. Loving someone doesn't mean holding them back, she said softly. It means not clipping their wings. The words pierced through him, not heavy but freeing, the kind of love that gave without demanding in return. The night of his departure, Malik tried to be strong for Ava. Their small apartment had been stripped down to essentials, boxes stacked against the wall. Ava giggled as she and Naomi made a paper chain, each loop marking a week until his return. Her eyes were serious as she looped the final piece. Later, when Malik knelt to hug her goodbye, she pressed her face into his chest and whispered, "Daddy says hearts don't care about distance." Then she turned and ran into Naomi's arms, clutching her as if she had been there forever. A year passed, heavy and fast. Malik worked harder than he ever had, his nights filled with textbooks and his days spent in training. He missed birthdays, bedtime stories, the warmth of Ava's small hand in his. But each week a paper link came off the chain back in Boston, each call with Naomi's steady voice reminding him he was not forgotten. And when the year ended, he stepped off the bus into the city air, wearing a freshly pressed coat and an ID badge clipped to his pocket, Malik Johnson, certified medical technician. It looked almost unreal, like a promise finally kept. That same morning, an envelope appeared on his desk, the script elegant and familiar. An invitation to a product launch celebration for Caldwell Organics, Rooftop Garden, 3 o'clock. The rooftop was strung with lights, the late afternoon sun washing the rows of chairs in gold. Naomi stood at the podium, her voice carrying with the clarity of someone who had built not just a company but a legacy. She spoke of nourishment, of dignity, of second chances. Malik stood quietly among the crowd, his heart pounding, and when her eyes found him, the rest of the room faded. After the speech, she moved toward him, her steps sure, her presence drawing him in like gravity. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said softly. Malik's voice was low but steady. "I wasn't sure you'd still want me here." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "Impossible." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. She didn't kneel, didn't make a spectacle. She simply opened it, revealing a plain band with a single unassuming stone. "I don't want to save you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I just want to stay. If you'll let me." Malik's breath caught. His answer came in a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything he had endured. "I can't give you wealth, power, or status." Naomi's eyes softened, a smile ghosting across her lips. "I didn't come looking for those. I came looking for you." His chest broke open with relief, and he nodded, the word yes trembling out of him like a vow. That evening, the three of them returned to the restaurant where everything had begun. The same polished wood, the same candlelight, but the table by the window was no longer lonely. Malik sat beside Naomi, their hands linked with ease, while Ava climbed happily into her own chair, her braids bouncing as she spread a drawing across the table, 3 figures under a roof with a yellow door. "This is us," she said proudly. "Daddy, Mommy Naomi, and me." Malik's eyes shimmered as he looked from the paper to the faces before him. A year ago, he had walked into that same restaurant with $50 and fragile hope. Now he sat surrounded by love, family, and a future no longer out of reach. The candlelight flickered, laughter rose around them, and for the first time in years, Malik allowed himself to believe without reservation. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue. Just a quiet miracle, earned one choice at a time, until 3 chairs at one table became the beginning of a life they would build together.